harbor no special objectives in Kuwait.
We don't stand a chance if we don't get aid from our friends.
You're dealing with one of the real madmen of the 20th century.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the tiny country that is a primary source of oil for much of the Western world. But tonight, the United States, the Soviet Union, Israel, and other powers are concentrating on diplomatic and economic solutions to this surprising and dangerous development. The invasion by 100,000 Iraqi troops backed by air cover and tanks was brutally efficient. Iraq wants control of Kuwait's territory, its oil, and the money that comes with it. Iraq insists that it was invited in by a rebel Kuwaiti government, but no one believes that. We have on the telephone now Karen Glass, an American working in Kuwait. She's at the Hilton Hotel, which is across from the U.S. Embassy. Ms. Glass, are you hearing any military movements tonight, shots and so on?
Yes, about 20 minutes ago, there was probably 15 minutes worth of heavy movement not far away from the complex that I'm currently sitting in, and sporadic gunfire.
From what you are able to see, are there many casualties? We've had a wide variety of reports ranging from just a few up to 200 and 300.
I have had no personal contact with any sort of casualties. I've heard those rumors myself.
Tell us about the streets now of Kuwait City, which is the capital. Iraqi troops everywhere?
Yes.
Well, apparently we lost the telephone connection to Kuwait City. No surprise there tonight. It is quite late. Thank you, Karen Glass. And from the moment of the invasion last night, that was U.S. time when the invasion occurred last night, the White House and the Pentagon have been on full alert trying to decide the United States options, and there aren't many. NBC's John Cochran and Fred Francis are covering these developments tonight. John, of course, the president was up all night long, and then he was off to Aspen for a previously scheduled meeting with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Tom, that's right. The president came to Colorado to warn against making massive cuts in defense spending. He has long planned to say that because of trouble spots like the Gulf region, the world is still a dangerous place. When he first scheduled this trip, he had no idea how right he was.
This morning at the White House, the president seemed to rule out military action against Iraq.
I'm not contemplating such action, and I, again, would not discuss it if I were.
But by the time Bush arrived in Colorado for a long-scheduled meeting with Britain's Prime Minister Thatcher, the president changed his strategy, hoping to create doubts in the mind of Iraq's Saddam Hussein.
And we're not ruling any options in, but we're not ruling any options out.
The British leader implied that the United Nations should consider military action if Iraq ignores the Security Council's call to withdraw from Kuwait.
None of us can do it separately. We need a collective and effective will of the nations belonging to the United Nations.
The Soviets joined in the condemnation of their old friends in Baghdad. After talks in Siberia with Secretary of State Baker, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze agreed to halt arms sales to Iraq. And in an unusual move, Baker and Shevardnadze agreed to continue talks in Moscow tomorrow on the Gulf crisis. In Washington, the Iraqi ambassador tried to justify the invasion, saying his country was simply trying to restore order in Kuwait. But no one else in Washington bought that.
I would not rule out military action. I wouldn't and be in favor of it unilaterally, but you're dealing with a madman.
The House unanimously backed President Bush's freeze on both Iraqi and Kuwaiti assets in the U.S., and the House added further economic sanctions. And faced with a possible cutoff of Gulf oil, the Senate gave Bush extra authority to use emergency oil reserves.
The president, meanwhile, warned that if Iraq harms American oil workers in Kuwait, then all bets are off on U.S. military intervention. Tom?
Thanks, John Cochran in Aspen tonight. And Fred Francis now is at the Pentagon. Fred, there are reports out of the State Department that a few American oil field workers were rounded up by the invading Iraqis, and then they were taken somewhere that we don't know. Even if the United States wanted to rescue them, what are the military options tonight?
Well, Tom, there are no realistic military options to push the Iraqis from Kuwait, or more seriously, to keep the Iraqis from invading other Gulf states.
Kuwait's small army was the victim of exactly what would face American forces if they were rushed into the fray.
overwhelming numbers of battle-tested Iraqi troops, well-armed and well-supplied. Kuwait, nonetheless, has asked for U.S. military muscle.
Let me say that we would like to have military assistance in order to survive. I think the U.S. intervention at this stage is both paramount and important.
But Pentagon officials say there will be no military rescue of Kuwait. The hard facts are that it would take more than 100,000 U.S. soldiers and 2 months of staging to retake the captured oil kingdom. And although the aircraft carrier Independence was moved close to the Persian Gulf today, it and 13 other Navy ships would be better suited for an oil blockade of Iraq, which was discussed, but would be a disaster for Western economies. Curiously, Iran's leaders have said little about the invasion. One analyst said Iran must be enjoying the U.S. dilemma since the United States sided so strongly with Iraq during the Persian Gulf War. The president might be forced to war with Iraq if Saddam Hussein moves on the Saudi oil fields a few hundred miles away. Precisely what some say Iraq plans to do to dominate the Arab world.
And to do it by manipulating military forces and by taking over the most important natural resource, which is oil.
The U.S. has an old agreement to help defend Saudi Arabia, and tens of millions of dollars of war supplies are stored in the Desert Kingdom. Hussein knows all that, and U.S. officials said today Hussein will not move on Saudi Arabia and trigger a U.S. military response. But Tom, those same officials as late as yesterday afternoon were saying that Kuwait wouldn't be attacked. Now that was a failure of U.S. intelligence and diplomatic analysis, and it could happen again. Tom?
Thanks very much, Fred Francis at the Pentagon tonight. This, of course, is familiar territory for Richard Murphy. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East during the Reagan administration. He's now a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Murphy, the Iraqi ambassador says that they could be in there for only a few days. Do you have any reason to believe that?
No, I have no reason to believe that they have any decision made at all about how long they'll stay. They shouldn't be in there, and they have, as far as I can tell, invented this talk of a revolutionary government.
Are the Iraqi objectives all related to oil and the money that comes with it?
Oil, money, and territory. They have long sought territory which is for them strategic, some islands off the northern coast of Kuwait, which is up against the Iraqis' only access to the Gulf.
You heard the Fred Francis report about the limitations on our military options now. Do you agree with that, or should we putting up more of a show of force in the Persian Gulf area?
Well, I think I agree there are limitations, but I don't think there's any point in speculating about what can be done. The president was dead right not to get into any details because we should keep the parties out there guessing as to what we can do. And as we found in 87, 88, we have quite a variety of measures that can be taken.
We have a lot of Americans, of course, on the ground in Kuwait. What are the dangers that we'll have still more hostages now in that part of the world?
I don't think Iraq's looking for that. I think, if you remember, a week ago, when he called in our ambassador, that was just after we had a small technical exercise involving the UAE. He made it plain, apparently, that there was no quarrel between the United States and Iraq. He's not looking to expand it in that way. But he's unpredictable. He's not a madman, but he is unpredictable.
Thank you very much, Richard Murphy in Washington tonight. What is the Israeli reaction to all of this, and oil prices, what now for them? Well, we'll have those stories and other dimensions of these important developments when I return with this special edition of NBC Nightly News. The other big power in the Arab world in the Middle East is Iraq's archenemy, Syria. And today, Syria called the invasion by Iraq of Kuwait a dangerous development and pushed for an Arab summit to deal with it this weekend. Other Arab countries, as well as Israel, were waiting for Iraq's next move. NBC's Martin Fletcher in Israel tonight.
Kuwait appealed for help from its Arab brothers and got only silence. The other Gulf states are keeping quiet, hoping Iraq will be satisfied with devouring Kuwait. TV news in Saudi Arabia tonight didn't even mention the Iraqi invasion. Silence in the Middle East means fear. Nobody wants to upset Iraq. Arab states are trembling. In the last Gulf War, Iraq proved it had a long arm by bombing international shipping 500 miles down the Persian Gulf. And Iraq proved today it's just as willing to use its force now as it did then. But analysts believe Iraq will go no further.
There are precious few options left for this megalomaniac to actually exercise his megalomania. there is, of course, the Israeli option, and I wouldn't rule that out.
But Israel has a long arm of its own, and military sources here say Israel isn't worried about an Iraqi attack yet. In fact, Israel's delighted. Analysts here say the longer the crisis in the Persian Gulf lasts, the better it is for Israel. With the Palestinian uprising in its 32nd month, Israel's come under growing pressure from Washington to negotiate a peace deal with the Palestinians. Now they hope that'll go on the back burner. Israel's long been warning the United States to take Saddam Hussein's threat seriously. Now Israel's been proved right. It's hard for Israeli leaders to avoid saying, "I told you so." Marlon Fletcher, NBC News, Tel Aviv.
And joining us now from Tel Aviv is Israel's Deputy Foreign Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu, you can say that the Israelis have been going around saying, "We told you that this could happen," but what about the Israeli options now? What can you do, and what are your obligations and responsibilities?
Well, I think it's important first that we assess exactly what we're up against, because that will determine our response. This is a man who threatened to clobber the Kurds in Iraq. He did it. He threatened to invade Iran. He did it. He threatened to invade Kuwait. He did that. Now he's threatening to burn half of Israel. Well, Israel, as you know, is not Kuwait, but we take him seriously. And the important thing is not what we will do. We will know, and we do know, how to defend ourselves. The important thing is for the international community to wake up, to realize there is a growing menace here. It's a menace to peace in the Middle East. It's a menace to the world. And the international community has to take a very hard look and begin to take hard action, economic action, political action, very tough action against Iraq.
And what about the military option?
Well, these are things that could always be discussed and not on television, and this is something that we're not changing our policies as a result of what has happened. We know what we have to do to defend ourselves. But I think that the international community for too long has not acted, has not sent any messages to Iraq at all.
But as long as Saddam Hussein is in control of Iraq, can that part of the world be considered at all safe?
Well, I don't think it's a safe neighborhood here in the first place. I think for too long people have believed that the source of all the conflict in the Middle East is the Palestinian problem, something that we want to solve, as you know. But I think that the real source of the problem is these uninhibited appetites, the league of dictators and men of blood. Arafat is in league with Saddam, and a few others are as well. It's these brothers in blood with their credo of terror and violence, their belief that through violence and war they can achieve their aims. This is the real source of the danger in the Middle East. And it's time that we recognize it, and it's time that we took action against them.
Benjamin Netanyahu, thank you very much for being with us tonight. If there is one word for this man who was behind the invasion, it is ruthless. Saddam Hussein's credentials go back more than 30 years, when he was a hitman on the team that tried to assassinate Iraq's ruler at that time. More now from NBC's Tom Pettit.
Saddam Hussein is a general who has no military education. He is a popular president who has never been elected by the people. He is a dictator.
Saddam is in the Mussolini-Hitler category. He's a gambler, he's a killer, and he's somebody who wants to make himself the dominant power.
Hussein wants to dominate the entire Middle East. He invaded Iran, and though the 8-year war ended in stalemate, Hussein emerged with the strongest army outside of Israel. And his affinity for war remained. Using chemical weapons against Iran and in his own country to put down a minority of Kurdish people. Building a nuclear installation outside Baghdad, which Israel bombed in 1981. Getting the design for a huge piece of artillery and trying to smuggle the parts out of England. The whole world has been suspicious of Hussein since the seizure of nuclear detonators bound for Iraq, which indicated he was up to his old nuclear tricks again. Iraq, once known as Mesopotamia, has been ravished by invading armies for centuries. At age 53, Saddam Hussein has learned how to play on ancient passions. Above all, he has learned the art of the double cross, as Egyptian President Mubarak discovered. Just last week, Hussein promised Mubarak no action against Kuwait. Tom Pettit, NBC News, London.
In a moment, how Saddam Hussein and his army will affect the lives of Americans, the prices that we pay at gasoline pumps, and well beyond that. Those shots fired by the Iraqi army were heard in financial markets around the world. Oil prices soared today. There was concern about rising gasoline prices and, of course, about inflation. NBC's chief financial correspondent is Mike Jensen.
News of the Iraqi invasion hit the Japanese stock market like a howitzer shell. The Japanese are very dependent on Middle East oil, and the prospect of a cutoff sent shudders through their markets. Same thing in London. Crude oil prices shot up 10%. By the time markets opened in the U.S., traders and investors were extremely worried. Crude oil prices jumped, and stock prices tumbled because of fears that higher oil prices would be inflationary and hurt corporate profits. Except for oil companies, their profits would go up. So today their stock went up. If the higher crude oil prices stick, it will mean 5 to 7 cents more at the pump.
It's higher now than it was last year at the same time. It's been going up every day now.
I think we need to address the whole issue of, getting our own oil production up.
Some motorists worried about a rerun of the 1970s. Back then, the U.S. imported 35% of its oil. Now it imports 50%. But that's not as worrisome as it might seem, because the U.S. has an oil stockpile stored in salt domes, enough to cover 81 days of lost imports. Also, less than 10% of U.S. imports come from Iraq and Kuwait, and there's a glut of oil.
We do not see any reason for a permanent long-term price increase by virtue of that oil from Iraq and from Kuwait not coming to the United States.
Still, if the unrest spread to the entire Persian Gulf, that would be another matter. And even without shortages, there could be big problems. Higher oil prices sending a ripple of inflation through the economy.
Then the Federal Reserve Board would have to push interest rates higher, and that would run the risk of sending an already fragile economy into a recession. Tom?
Mike, you're at the New York Mercantile Exchange where the price of oil now is negotiated. What are the long-term prospects that the price of oil will go up sharply as a result of all of this?
Tom, nobody around here or anybody else I've talked to thinks that there's going to be a huge increase in the price of oil. Nobody thinks there's going to be a big stock market collapse. What most people worry about is that even a modest increase in the price of oil would have a sufficient inflationary effect that it could hurt the economy, perhaps even send it into a recession. Things are a lot worse today than they were yesterday at this time.
All right, thanks very much, Mike Jensen, tonight. And this, of course, at a time when the economy is already vulnerable. Wall Street took news of this invasion on the chin today. The Dow Industrials were down more than 34 points. Volume was heavy. Saddam Hussein, the cold-blooded Iraqi leader, is widely admired in his country and reviled in most of the rest of the world. But the big question is, how do we deal with him? NBC's Andrea Mitchell joins us from Washington tonight. John Cochran still is in Colorado, which was the site of the presidential trip earlier today. Andrea, is this going to have any impact on the congressional debate about cutting back on America's military expenditures?
Well, it just did. The B-2 bomber just survived a crucial test in the Senate. People up here are frustrated, they're angry, and they are hawkish. Yes, even liberals are talking about military action as long as it's coordinated with the allies. They are publicly supportive of the president because it's a crisis, but there's a lot of grumbling that he should have imposed sanctions on Iraq before now.
And John Cochran in Colorado, there is a new dimension to all of this. The United States and the Soviet Union are openly cooperating.
Absolutely. People have talked for years if only the Soviet Union and the United States could cooperate in the Middle East. Now it appears they are. It could even come to this. If the UN Security Council at some point decides that the Iraqis aren't going to pull out of Kuwait, the Security Council could decide to take military action as it did in Korea in 1950. It seems possible now that the Soviets would not veto such a move. They would have only a few years ago, Tom.
Thank you very much, John Cochran, tonight in Aspen, Colorado. In a moment, a final look at where things stand tonight with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. So tonight, the mightiest military machine in the Arab world, Iraq, remains in control of its prosperous, tiny neighbor of Kuwait. There are reports that a few American oil workers have been rounded up. The president says the United States is not ruling out any options or ruling them in. Tonight, we did get several views on Iraq and what has been called its naked aggression against Kuwait.
I have no reason to believe that they have any decision made at all about how long they'll stay. They shouldn't be in there, and they have as far as I can tell, invented this talk of a revolutionary government.
The important thing is for the international community to wake up, to realize there is a growing menace here. It's a menace to peace in the Middle East. It's a menace to the world. And the international community has to take a very hard look and begin to take hard action, economic action, political action, very tough action against Iraq.
And for American consumers, of course, if crude oil prices don't come down, gasoline prices will go up from 5 to 7 cents a gallon. The bottom line tonight, no one knows for sure just what Saddam Hussein of Iraq has in mind in his invasion in Kuwait. That's Nightly News for this Thursday night. I'm Tom Brokaw, and we will have continuing coverage of this Iraqi invasion on this NBC station. And I'll see you for sure again tomorrow night.